Hello and welcome to the Summer 2022 Product Launch Announcement video. My name is Julie Price. I'm a Senior Product Manager here at SingleStore, and I'm really excited to introduce you to one of the newest features in SingleStoreDB, the Data API. It's one of several features that we're launching as part of the Summer 2022 announcement. The Data API is an interface that enables running SQL commands in SingleStoreDB over HTTP. So this means that you can use any HTTP client to connect to SingleStoreDB, which was not possible before. Also, it provides its response in JSON, which is understood by virtually any client, so it opens up lots of opportunity for building different types of applications with different programming languages in a much easier fashion. It's also OpenAPI compatible, which enables you to generate type-safe clients as well. So again, making it super easy to build applications in all different platforms. We've got lots of different options for connecting to your SingleStoreDB, and a lot of those options, like the MySQL clients or ODBC and JDBC, are based on TCP. And making connections over TCP can be really expensive, so people end up using connection pools so that you don't have to open so many connections. And those connection pools are cumbersome to manage, they impact cold start performance, and also TCP connections, they're persistent connections against a database, and this can be problematic for applications that aren't on a consistent network. So if you think about IoT or mobile applications where you might be jumping between cell phone towers, if that happens and you lose the network on a persistent connection, the application is going to fail. It's going to come back with an error, and that's a terrible experience from a user perspective or from a client perspective. And also, lots of modern applications are built in ways that don't actually enable TCP connections, so you can't even use the MySQL client or ODBC and JDBC in these cases. And finally, applications are often not running in the same network as your SingleStoreDB, and so they will require more complex architectures with static VPNs and load balancers that need to be maintained by the infrastructure team and make it difficult if something does change, like you want to move where the SingleStoreDB is, you've got to reconfigure all of that architecture in order to make sure that your application continues to run. There's quite a few really amazing benefits that you'll get using the Data API. So first of all, I mentioned that it's a JSON endpoint. So since the Data API speaks JSON, it's really trivial to send and receive data from JavaScript in particular. There's no custom client libraries needed at all to do that. But on top of that, there really is infinite client support. So pretty much every programming language understands JSON, can communicate over HTTP, and so you can use this API to build applications in pretty much any programming language. Another thing that's really amazing is that it does maintain its own connection pools under the hood. So when we talk about that cold start performance, it gets really minimized, and also the maintenance headache of connection pools is totally eliminated from the administrators. The Data API also is completely stateless, so each request and response is completely independent of each other. So you make the request, your network drops, you can still get that response back because it is stateless in that sense. Well, the Data API can run on multiple aggregators in your SingleStoreDB environment, so it will have natural load balancing built in. And the last benefit that I'll mention, which really should not be ignored, is that it's fully integrated with the HTTP ecosystem. And if you think about what that means, every major corporation in the world sends and receives data over HTTP, and so a lot of huge companies have been contributing to the evolution of HTTP, and we automatically gain all of that advantage of the evolution and investment in this space with the Data API. If you think about the way that modern applications are starting to be built, you're thinking about things like serverless application tiers where infrastructure is spinning up and spinning down as the workloads burst and as more resources are needed. And you're thinking about maybe single page web browser applications that are pretty simple, and those type of applications communicate very easily over HTTP. So those are two prime examples. I'll talk a little bit more about what it means for each one. So when we think about serverless applications, stateless HTTP request and response is a much more natural fit for serverless application tiers. They really heavily optimize and accelerate HTTP, and they're going to benefit from that out-of-the-box connection pooling and cold start performance optimizations, so that when your first person requests something from the application and there's no infrastructure running at all, we're going to minimize the amount of time that it actually takes to get that request back, so that your first request, your 100th request, it shouldn't matter. Your performance should be optimized. Now, for those single page applications, web browsers can't directly open TCP connections against the database. But the data API, since it's HTTP-based, can. So any type of application running in browser can now connect directly to SingleStoreDB. You don't have to worry about having an application server or a proxy or any of that kind of middleware in between the browser and the database, which is really, really cool. And again, I'll just mention data API speaks JSON, no big deal, can easily communicate with JavaScript with no custom client libraries needed at all. The third and final use case that I'll mention, it's not the final use case overall, but the third one I'll talk about right now is building SaaS integrations. So the data API, sending data and requests and responses over HTTP, is a much better fit for SaaS integrations. Often when you're building an integration with a SaaS tool, you don't have the ability to install an ODBC driver or install different types of client libraries. And so the data API really makes it much easier to build these type of integrations with your SaaS tools so that you can connect directly to your SingleStoreDB. So if you take a look at the slide that I have up right now, I mentioned that it's an alternative to those persistent TCP-based connections like the MySQL clients, like ODBC and JDBC connections that might require some of that additional infrastructure in the middle. Won't talk a lot about how that works, but how the data API works differently is that it is a stateless request and response API. So each request, each response is its own stream. Connections are dynamically reconfigured as needed. So if the network changes, if network drops, no big deal. Your application is still going to continue to run. So completely tolerant of those type of network faults that might occur with applications that maybe aren't running on a static environment. And it leverages out-of-the-box HTTP proxy and load balancers rather than having to maintain those static VPNs and load balancers that you would have to do in a more traditional architecture. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the life of a SQL query that's passed into SingleStoreDB through the data API. So what we've done, we've added a new endpoint, which is essentially just a port that's listening for these HTTP requests to come in. As I mentioned, it's a simple request and response API. So the request would be an application sending a SQL command along with the database on which to run that command and the authentication details of how to authenticate against the database, sends all of that information to the HTTP endpoint. The API then is going to run exactly what was fed, so the SQL command that was fed in. And behind the scenes, it will connect over a persistent connection to SingleStoreDB. It'll run the query will return the results, and the data API is going to encode the results into JSON and send them back to the application as a stream of nested JSON as each row is received. So this is really important because it means there's no buffering of the response. It is really highly performant, and you don't have a concern for overwhelming memory by caching the full data set. So you can work with really large volumes of data and still get really snappy responses from your applications. So that's a little bit about how the SingleStoreDB data API works. And I'd like to thank you for taking the time with me to learn all about the data API. And I'm super excited to hear about all of the amazing things that you're going to build with it.